Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this COVID-19 Quick Hits webcast. Today we have CRI partners Alan Jowers and Rich Morera to provide an overview of the American Rescue Plan Act. Before we get started, I just would like to touch on a couple of housekeeping items. So as a reminder, we are not able to offer continuing professional education for our Quick Hits webcast. The slides from today's presentation will be made available through the chat section of Zoom, and it will also be on the CRI website soon after we finish. You will get a recording of this presentation sometime within the next 24 hours, usually right at 24 hours, to the email that you registered with. And we'll go through Q&A at the end of the presentation. But just as a reminder, we may not be able to get to all questions. So if your question isn't answered, you can connect with your CRI advisor at cricpa.com/contact. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Alan.
All right, thank you very much, Mary Allison, and welcome to everybody here from sunny Destin, Florida. Glad you could be here with us to go over a little bit of this ARP information. And really what we're going to talk about today specifically is the SLFRF, the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. I'm not sure how exactly you would pronounce that acronym. I don't know if it's SLUFR or SLIFR for whatever, but we'll call it SLFRF for today. And where this comes from is the American Rescue Plan, which was passed in March. And the American Rescue Plan created several different pieces of money, several different buckets of money. You have rental assistance money. You have money for several other types of programs that the federal government has put together. And one of the pieces of that American Rescue Plan was this State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. And essentially what that did, as you probably know, is it created an allocation of about $350 billion directly to states, tribal governments, and local governments, particularly counties and municipalities. So there's a direct allocation of dollars. We've got a couple of examples coming up of just some dollar figures that the federal government is making available to these local governments. And what it's doing is it's providing a lot of flexibility in its spending way. And Rich is going to talk a little bit about some of the broad categories of eligible expenses that's designed so that each local government or each state can kind of design what they want to serve their needs. And there is a way that these local governments, you request your direct allocation through an online portal. So the federal government makes available this large pot of money specifically to these small local governments. You can go in and request that from the federal government. And I wanted to give kind of a broad overview of some of the amounts that we're talking about. You can see it is a direct allocation of funds. I've lived primarily in 4 places in my life. I didn't put Destin, Florida on there, which is where I am now, but I spent a year in Tuscaloosa in grad school and spent a few years in Tallahassee going to college, and I lived in Atlanta for a little while. My wife was born in Alexandria, Louisiana, so that's why I picked that one. But you can see the column in the middle, that's the allocation of dollars to those municipalities coming from the SLFRF. So Tuscaloosa is getting $20 million. That's their allocation. Tallahassee, $46 million. And the number on the far right was just through a web search, kind of finding their annual budgets. So Tuscaloosa's annual budget is 154 million, and they're getting in this one-shot deal $20 million from the federal government as a stipend or shot in the arm or whatever you want to call it from an economic standpoint. You can see, city of Atlanta is getting 170 million. That's just the city of Atlanta. If you live in the Atlanta metro, I mean, there's Fulton County, Gwinnett County, Cobb County, DeKalb County, and then you have all the municipalities, places like Roswell, Marietta, Lawrenceville, Peachtree City. Each of those local governments is getting its own separate allocation. So there's a lot of money, obviously, that's being pushed out into our local governments and into our state governments. And what you see is these are supposed to cover, these amounts, those middle column amounts, are supposed to cover costs that have been incurred by the end of 2024. And those amounts be expended by 2026. So they want you to kind of have the projects ready to go, at least within the next 2 to 3 years. And then they're giving you a lot of flexibility up to an additional 5 years to actually spend the money. And like I said, Rich is going to cover what some of these eligible costs are. So big chunks of money, a lot of flexibility on what you can use them for, and a decent sized time frame in order to incur those costs. There are some reporting requirements that come with this. And one of the things I wanted to point out right up front, there is an initial interim report that's actually due at the end of, this month. And then after that, there will be quarterly or annual reports that are due. And right now they're due 30 days after each quarter end. So each time, December 31, we'll have to have something filed by the end of January. March 31, we'll have to have something filed by the end of April. For those local governments that have larger populations, there's actually a plan that you have to kind of come up, a report that goes over your plan for that. And these funds are going to be subject to single audit. So if you're a municipality, you know how you present to CFA. These sorts of funds will be amounts that will go on that single audit, that CFA, and they will be subject to being audited from a federal standpoint. For the smaller cities or smaller counties that maybe you don't typically have or don't spend $750,000 of federal monies, this may cause you to have a single audit. So that's something that you should talk to your auditors about for sure. And there are plenty of webinars and materials on this that are available from Treasury. And so, from a standpoint of understanding the reporting and some of the other requirements, there's plenty of materials on that. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Rich Morera, who's about an hour down the road from me in Panama City Beach. And he's going to talk through some of the actual expenditures and areas that you can use this money for.
Thank you, Alan. It is an hour down the road, but we always say it's a little sunnier here in Panama City Beach and the water's a little bit prettier. So if you have the opportunity, you got to check it out here. But we're going to get to the fun part now. How can we use these funds? And, Alan kind of mentioned this is substantial money for these governments, and it's really important to decide how you're going to use these funds. There's a quote I saw when I researched. It said, in 10 years from now, there will be governments that look back at how these funds were spent and realize that they transformed the trajectory of their community for the positive and for the future. We were all kind of wishing and hoping COVID-19 would be gone by now or on a down slope, and obviously it's not. But this is kind of a silver lining on how you guys can spend these funds, and is a positive thing that can happen to your community. As you look at it, you're gonna have to kind of decide, do you want to look at it from a short-term perspective or a long-term perspective? So when we go over the different areas, we're gonna look at some of these, areas are kind of short-term things, and some of these are long-term. And it's really going to depend on your government and your area on where and how you want to spend those funds. And it's going to be done not just by the politicians. It's not just your city council members, your county commissioners. It's not just city managers and county managers. It's not just budget and finance. Really, it should be a team effort to everybody get together and say, what can we do with these funds that best addresses the needs that the pandemic caused, and how can we use these funds to, help our community in the future. Another thing to point out too, unfortunately, as we know with the CARES funds that came out, and if you dealt with PPP or employee retention credits, these are major programs that came out very quickly. And I do think that the Treasury Department and the government got these funds out quickly to help, but unfortunately, the guidance isn't always clear. And, when you really start getting into the weeds of how these funds can be spent, there's still a lot of unanswered questions. So the first area we're going to look at is those hardest hit communities. Unfortunately, COVID has impacted certain communities, especially those of low income and of color, dramatically. I saw a study to show that counties with high poverty rates have higher rates of deaths, with 223 deaths per 100,000 citizens, compared to the US average of 175. So there is a desire to see these funds spent on those kind of areas, the areas that were most hardly hit. This can be done through programs to address health disparities and social detriments of health. So you're going to see programs that implement or enhance community health workers, public benefit navigators, and community violence intervention programs. You're going to see investments in housing neighborhoods. So things like services that address homelessness, affordable housing developments, housing vouchers, assistance to make it easier to move into neighborhoods with higher economic opportunities. Areas to address educational disparities. So this is things such as new or expanded early learning services, providing additional resources to high poverty school districts, and offering educational services like tutoring or after school programs. And finally, to promote healthy childhood environments. So this is including newer expanded high quality childcare, home visiting programs for families with young children, and enhanced services for child welfare. The next area we're going to look at is public health. So when we look at public health, we're going to look at services and programs that contain and mitigate spread of COVID-19. So there are going to be some obvious ones here. You're going to see vaccination programs that are going to be covered, medical expenses, testing, contract tracing, PPE purchases, capital investments in public facilities, and enhancements of public health data systems. There's kind of an overreaching theme through some of the areas you can spend these funds that deal with technology. And when you start deciding if you want to use kind of a short-term or long-term perspective, technology and technology you can implement now that will help your government in the future is an area a lot of our governments are starting to look at as a way to use these funds in more of a long-term perspective. There's also services to address behavioral healthcare needs, things like mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, and behavioral related hotlines. And then much like the CARES funds that came out originally, there is an opportunity for payroll and covered benefits for employees to the extent that they worked on COVID-19 response. Now, if we get into the next one, which is economic impacts, this is looking at things like delivering assistance to workers and families. And this can be everything from aid to unemployed workers, job training, as well as to households facing food or other financial issues. Also, these funds can be used to support survivor benefits for family members that have lost folks to COVID-19, unfortunately. There's also a push to support small businesses, so helping them to address their challenges, things like making investments in COVID-19 prevention and mitigation tactics, as well as providing technical assistance. You're going to see this being done through various methods, everything from loans, grants, in-kind assistance, and counseling programs. Then there's a hope or a need to speed the recovery of certain sectors. The ones outlined there say tourism, travel, and hospitality, but it may really depend on your area. It doesn't have to be those sectors. Here in Panama City Beach, 2020 was obviously a bad year, the first year of COVID, but 2021 actually, without getting into politics of it, Florida was open quick, as you guys all know, and there was a lot of growth here in 2020 in hospitality. Our bed tax numbers this summer were the highest we've ever seen. So in an area such as ours, tourism or hospitality may not be an area that our governments are going to see money spent on. But the idea here is you can look at the sectors in your community that were most impacted and see how you can, assist those sectors. There's also an opportunity to rebuild public sector capacity. So this is going to mean rehiring your staff to pre-pandemic levels, and also allowing you to replenish unemployment insurance trust funds to those pre-pandemic levels. Funds can also be used to build internal capacity to successfully implement economic relief programs and technology infrastructure. So there we go again with technology. There's some programs that within your government, if you can kind of implement these programs that are going to help for the future, it's something to consider. One area that may be beneficial for your government is premium pay for those essential workers. This can be done through grants, and it's really a broad range of essential workers who had to be physically present during the pandemic. And the list is pretty extensive. Anything from, staff at nursing homes, hospitals, home care settings, workers at farms, food production facilities, grocery stores, restaurants, sanitation workers, truck drivers, childcare workers, educators. So that list is pretty long. So if that's an area that your government feels, hey, we want to help these folks out, it's an opportunity to do that. The calculation is basically it's up to $13 above what they consider regular wages, and there is a cap of $25,000 per employee. And realizing that a lot of these folks have been working hard for a long time without any additional compensation, there is a provision to allow for some retrospective premium pay if that's something you choose to do. Okay, the next one is what I kind of consider the low-hanging fruit. And I suggest and have advised all my governments to at least go through this exercise because there is a lot of if you do meet if you meet the needs, you're able to use these funds with a lot more flexibility. Obviously a lot of governments have been facing budget shortfalls because of the pandemic, and depending on your government and your revenue streams, some revenue streams are obviously down. Sales tax collections, gas tax collections in 2020 especially were down. If you're an ad valorem generated government, the housing market has actually gone up, so that may not be an area that's going to help you as far as this calculation. But ultimately, the concept here is that this revenue is supposed to help governments not have to cut government services. And Treasury has established a very detailed methodology to calculate how to determine your revenue loss. There's a calculator that the GFOA has, CRI. We kind of have an internal one we're working on to assist our governments. And specifically, the recipients will compute the extent of the reduction in revenue by comparing the actual revenue to an alternative representing what could have been expected to occur. So in other words, what they're going to do is they're going to look at where your revenue was prior to the pandemic. They're going to determine either through looking in your average annual growth over the last 3 years prior to the pandemic. So, where you were, where you would have been based on your average in the 3 years prior. Or the other option is to use a 4.1% average, which is a national average. So you'll go through that exercise, and whichever number is greater, either what it should have been in your government, or if that 4.1% number is greater, that'll be how your lost revenue is calculated. And then once you meet that metric, the good thing is you don't really have to prove that it's because of COVID-19. There's that presumption is there. And so your government's really going to have the opportunity to spend those funds as they wish. And more importantly, it's not a one-time thing. This is going to be done every year between 2020, 21, 22 through 2023. So this is something that you can do every year to see what that trend's showing and have the opportunity to take that revenue loss, which I mentioned, gives you a lot of flexibility. The last area we're going to look at is investments in infrastructure. This is another one that we're seeing some governments kind of jump on because it's an area that a lot of governments need help in. And it's an area that there's already maybe plans that they have that they just couldn't afford. And so these funds are allowing this to happen. So things with drinking water infrastructure are going to include things like building or upgrading facilities and transmissions, distribution and storage systems. There's going to be increases in wastewater and stormwater projects. So this is going to include constructing publicly owned treatment infrastructure, managing and treating stormwater, drainage, water, facilitating water reuse. The good thing about these programs is Treasury set them up to align with some programs that you may already be aware of, some grant programs out there, specifically the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So if you're familiar with those programs, you can use the same type of projects that are allowed in those projects can be used here. So you can either if you already have some projects, you can augment those if you have more funds, or you can create new projects that fall under those previously established programs. And then the last one goes back to that theme of technology. The pandemic has shown the importance of internet, and there's certain areas, certain communities that don't have good internet. And so this allows for your government to improve internet. And recipients are encouraged to prioritize projects that achieve what they call the last mile connection to households and businesses. Ultimately, what we're looking at is trying to help these areas achieve what they consider reliable speeds, and those are defined as speeds in the 100 megabytes per second, both on the download and upload. And then you can also look at fiber optic investments. So again, with broadband, it's, what can we do with those communities and those areas that don't have access to it? And that's a big push that we're also seeing some governments pursue. Now let's get to what's not allowed. Again, as we mentioned, the guidance is still not clear. There's certain things that are very kind of black and white at this point. One is when we talk about that lost revenue calculation, if you had a change in law that caused lost revenue, you have to account for that. So kind of to put that more simply, if you changed a law and got rid of a tax you normally had, and it was implemented in 2020 and that tax is no longer there, when you do that lost revenue calculation, you have to account for that. And then there's really some specific things that they have outlined. There's no deposits allowed in pension funds. There's also no funding of debt service, legal settlements, any deposits into any kind of rainy day funds or reserves. And then any infrastructure that's outside of what we talked about. So you can't do your general infrastructure. It has to be, those that we define, the water, sewer, and broadband infrastructures. And then there is transfers permitted. This is still an area we're helping some governments kind of get a feel for, but as long as the use is allowable, there are transfers permitted to private not-for-profit corporations, public benefit corporations for transportation, and some special purpose unit governments. So that is just very high level, how can we use these funds? We don't obviously get into specifics, but it just gives you kind of a general idea of some of the areas that you're able to start thinking about, and really thinking about, okay, from our government, for our local area, for our areas that were most impacted, how do we want to use these funds? And so I'm going to turn it back over to Alan now.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. That was all great information. I wanted to add one thing, because I know we have some offices in Alabama, and there's probably some other states that are like that, where the individual states, through their attorney general or other edicts, they actually might have further restrictions on some of the uses of this money. I think specifically in Alabama, based on a couple of rulings, it looks like perhaps the only thing really you can use this money for are those infrastructure type programs, the water and sewer and the broadband. So just, be careful within your individual location. There might be other further restrictions. Kind of the last topic to talk about before we answer a handful of questions is really just some items that we have kind of identified. We've had a working group with the ARP now for a few months. And some of the things that we have identified with some of our clients, and probably will apply to some of you on this call as well, some of the difficulties that you may find. And the first one, and I think Rich said it really eloquently about this can be transformational money, is really identifying the best uses of these funds. and making sure that, okay, we've gotten a $20 million investment. Do we want to use that $20 million for back pay, or do we want to use that $20 million to lay fiber optic cables throughout all of our neighborhoods so that, you know, homeschooling and home working is more of a reality? So really just kind of conceptually thinking through what are the best uses of those funds, and you know, again, making it a transformational impact. Maintaining compliance. I mean, you guys know about the use of federal funds. There's always strings that come attached to them, and so making sure that you have complied with the requirements so that you don't have to return this funding. Very important, and things that could come up. Changing requirements. We've seen this with PPP. We've seen this with other of these federal programs, like Rich mentioned about, you know, they get the money out as quickly as they can and kind of make up the rules as they go. And that has good, you know, good things and bad things, but really just making sure that you're staying on top of those requirements so that you're maintaining your compliance. Administrative burden of adding new programs. We've seen this internally with kind of the rental assistance programs that came up as a result of the ARP. You know, you're going to have to add a bunch of people perhaps to keep track of some of these new programs, particularly if you're doing more in the way of rental assistance and small business assistance, and accepting applications and grants and things like that. You know, finding people is difficult these days. And so perhaps, you know, adding some of these programs, even though you have the money to spend them, it's difficult because you're going to be taxing your people who are already taxed. And lastly, one of the things that we've seen is really establishing controls and processes for some of these new programs. If you do end up implementing new process or new programs as a result, really making sure that you stay within your control system and monitor it appropriately and communicate controls appropriately, and those types of things. So, you know, when you're looking to take this big chunk of money and spend it on the things that Rich talked about, here are some areas that really you need to kind of take a look at to make sure that you're not tripping yourself up. You know, identify those best uses, make sure you understand those changing requirements for compliance and those other items that have been identified. So that's kind of the end of our prepared comments. I know we do have a few questions. One of them relates to, we talked a little bit about single audit, and the question is, we've received these funds, or at least a portion of the funds, in fiscal year 21, but not going to spend them until fiscal year 22. When does it count towards the single audit? My understanding is that it will still count towards your expenditures. It's not necessarily the receipts of the money, it is the expenditures of the money. So I do think that just like with your normal CFA, it's going to be expenditure driven. So in that scenario where you're spending it in fiscal year 22, you would include it on your CFA for fiscal year of 22. One of the questions, are you saying in Alabama we cannot ask for funds for premium pay and revenue loss? I'm not an expert on Alabama law, but a couple of my partners in Alabama have made that representation to me. So the general point being, make sure that as whatever state that you're in, you understand the state requirements as well as the federal requirements. There are further restrictions coming from some of the Attorney General's comments, specifically in the state of Alabama. Rich, there's a question on here. You might be able to
I see a
answer
couple
a little
of these.
better.
Yeah, there's one about the revenue replacement and saying that it can't be used for infrastructure outside water and sewer. No, I think the lost revenue has very broad uses. So once you have that lost revenue, you can spend it in various methods. I think that bullet point was more just to be very clear, because I think some questions had come up. Is it just infrastructure, the ones that we outlined? The water, sewer, and broadband, and that's the point of that comment. Is that's all as far as using infrastructure funds specifically for that. There's no grants or funds that are be able to be used for that. But if you have lost revenue and decide to do general infrastructure with it, that's a different question, and I think you are allowed to use that as far as I know. Somebody liked the quote I paraphrased here on the 10 years from now, so I'll repeat it one more time. In 10 years from now, there will be governments that look back at how these funds are spent and realize that they transformed the trajectory of their community for the positive and for the future. So somebody wanted to hear that again. And so I do think it's an important quote, and it kind of puts things in perspective on not just, I think the revenue loss, I think the premium pay, and it works for your government, it's great, but, there is, opportunity here to really help, in the long term. And then the last one here about, do you know the answer to this last one, Alan? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I looked it up. The question is, if you haven't received any funds yet, do we still need to do the annual report that is coming up due at the end of this month? And I have gone to the guidance. I was kind of looking at the guidance while you were speaking earlier, and I don't see anything that says if you have not done anything. The report has a couple of different requirements. You're supposed to report any expenditures that you have incurred through July 31 of 2021, and then there's some programmatic data, if you will, kind of like your base year general revenue. What's your fiscal year end date? What growth adjustment are you using? So there's a handful of kind of qualitative, if you will, things. So my best guess, I don't see anything on here that says if you haven't spent or haven't received funds, you don't need to. My guess is if you intend to, if you have already requested your allocation or you intend to request your allocation, you probably should go on to their portal and at least answer as best you can some of these more qualitative questions, even if you have no expenditures today. And it does look like it's a fairly straightforward process to access their portal and to go on to the portal and fill out that report. And then after that, that's when the quarterly reports will start. And the quarterly report that's due, there'll be one for the quarter ending September 30. That will be due by October 30. And that will cover basically all the expenditures spent from inception through September 30. So that particular quarterly report will probably cover more than a 90-day period. But after that, it'll be 90-day period by 90-day period. But to specifically answer that question, because of some of those other qualitative answers, probably need to go ahead and get on that initial interim report, even if you haven't received or spent funds yet. Looks like we had. We had one more question about the small units, and that's something that we'll have to get back. Perhaps the person who asked that question, you can use the CRI contact and we'll get the question, your specific question answered. And speaking of contact, there is a cool way you can contact us, and I'll let Mary Allison kind of take from here and take us home.
All right. Thank you so much, Rich and Alan, for that presentation and for taking some time to do the Q&A with our attendees. So for the rest of you, as a reminder, if your specific question did not get answered or you still need additional clarification on anything, we encourage you to contact your local CRI advisor. Or if you're not sure who that may be, you don't have a CRI advisor or anything like that, you can scan the QR code on your screen to get to our contact form. So I'll give everyone a couple of moments to scan that if you'd like. If you're not able to scan the QR code, you can still just visit cricpa.com/contact, also there on the screen. So you can stay up to date with the latest from CRI by following our social media channels. We're on all the major platforms with handle @CRICPA. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a good rest of your day and a great almost weekend. Thanks.